We're reading All Things Even Frisky. And in the last chapter, Jimmy was missing. He got lost, and Billy and his friend Pete and the little dog Frisky went to go look for him, and they found him at the deserted house with a strange man claiming that Jimmy was his boy. Now we are on chapter 17, Prisoners. Billy wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but he was too frightened. His legs felt like noodles. He stared at the man in terror. Jimmy started to whimper. "I want Mommy." The man stooped down by the small boy and awkwardly stroked his hair. "Don't cry, son. I'll find your Mommy. Then we'll all be happy again." Suddenly, Billy remembered the headline in the newspaper. Could this be the man who escaped from the mental hospital? If only he could get out of here and get help. He began to sneak toward the door. The man grabbed him by the arm. "Not so fast, young man. You're not leaving. You might give away my secret. I'll find another length of rope for you." Billy's heart pounded wildly as the man tied him securely with a rope. "Please, God," he said over and over in his heart, but he was too frightened to pray anything else. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God. The words flashed into his mind. Maybe the verse was true before, but not this time, he mused. Being captured by a crazy man couldn't be good for anything, could it? But all the other bad things had worked out for good, even Frisky's getting lost. Suddenly, Billy remembered Frisky. Where was he? Was he lying under some bush dying all alone? And what about Jimmy? What would the crazy man do to them? Where was Pete? The words came back to Billy. All things work together for good to them that love God. That meant everything. Gradually, Billy's heart stopped beating so wildly. Jesus was with him, even out here in the deserted house. He was with Jimmy too, and Pete, and even Frisky. The minutes dragged on. The strange man opened a can of beans and hungrily devoured them. Billy suddenly realized he was hungry. He had forgotten to make himself a sandwich as Aunt Kate had suggested. He glanced at Jimmy. The small boy, exhausted from crying, had curled up on the floor and fallen asleep. Billy strained his ears for some sound that would tell him Frisky was still around. He could hear no familiar dog noises, just the singing of birds and the buzzing of the insects in the woods. The man walked back and forth nervously, in and out of the room. Then he lit a cigarette and sat down on the bed to smoke. The minutes seemed like hours to Billy as he waited, listened, and hoped. Suddenly, he heard something. What was it? Voices? Somebody coming through the bushes? Somebody downstairs? The man heard it too. He sprang up and looked around wildly. At that moment, the door burst open and a police officer appeared. "Well, here's our man," he exclaimed to the other members of the search party, who were right behind him. In a moment, they had surrounded the escapee and put handcuffs on him. Realizing he was outnumbered, the mental patient did not resist. "And here's Jimmy!" cried Mr. Parker, running to his son. The officer slashed the ropes that were tying Billy and Jimmy. Mr. Parker picked up his son. Everybody talked at once. Pete stood in the background, grinning. As the officers were taking the strange man away, Mr. Parker turned to Billy and Pete. "I don't know how to thank you boys for finding Jimmy." "It really wasn't us," answered Pete. "It was Frisky. We were just planning to look in the bushes, but Frisky ran into the house, so we came in too. That's how we found Jimmy." Mr. Parker said something about Frisky being the most wonderful dog in the world and deserving a steak, but Billy hardly heard him. Where was Frisky anyway? After the others had left, Billy and Pete searched the bushes around the deserted house for Frisky. "Maybe he crawled away to die," said Pete, not knowing how sad his words made Billy feel. "Dogs do that when they get hurt." Billy didn't answer. He couldn't. The lump in his throat was too big. Then they found him, down by the creek behind the house. He had crawled under the bushes and was lying with his head on his paws, his eyes closed. Tenderly, Billy picked him up and carried him home. Chapter 18, part of God's plan. Your dog has been badly hurt, said the veterinarian as he examined Frisky. I'm sorry, but there's nothing more I can do for him. Take him home and make him as comfortable as you can. Aunt Kate said Frisky could sleep in Billy's room that night, and Pete could stay overnight with Billy if his parents didn't mind. Pete slept in Billy's bed, and Billy slept on the floor in a sleeping bag beside Frisky. Mrs. Parker had sent over a steak for Frisky, but he was too sick to care about food. He didn't even want a drink of the warm milk that Aunt Kate had put in a dish for him. Aunt Kate came and turned out the light. Try to sleep now, boys, she said gently. There's nothing more you can do for Frisky. But Billy couldn't sleep. All he could do was think about Frisky. Billy, whispered Pete after a while. You asleep? No, Billy answered. Neither am I. I've been thinking about that guy grabbing me around the neck. Man, that was scary. Yeah, I know. I was scared just watching. The boys were silent for a time. Then Pete said, Billy, if Frisky dies, he'll be dying for me, won't he? Because if he hadn't started biting that man, the man would have killed me maybe. But I got away, and the man hurt Frisky instead. Yeah, you're right, said Billy. When Pete talked about Frisky's dying, Billy hurt inside. But Pete's words made him think of something he'd been wanting Pete to understand. Billy raised up on one elbow. It's something like what Jesus did for you and me and everybody, Pete, on the cross. Remember that little picture I drew for you once? Yeah, I remember. Jesus died in our place so we can live forever in heaven with God. He died for us so we can go free. Pete didn't answer. Billy dropped back on his pillow and stared into the darkness. Please, God, he prayed silently, help Pete to believe in you. Billy thought Pete had fallen asleep until Pete called him again. Hey, Billy? Yeah? I've been thinking. Maybe I should start going to Sunday school with you. You still want me to? Sure. Next Sunday, okay? Okay. Pete's words made Billy forget about the hurt inside him for a little while. Could Frisky's getting hurt be part of God's plan to get Pete started going to Sunday school and believing on him? A sense of awe filled Billy's heart. Wasn't God smart to be able to make all things, even the bad ones, work together for something good? He'll do what's best for Frisky, he told himself, suddenly feeling so drowsy he couldn't keep his eyes open. Billy didn't know how long he'd been sleeping, but suddenly he was awake. For a moment, he didn't remember why he was lying on the floor in a sleeping bag instead of his bed. Slowly, the events of the day before came back to him. Going to the deserted house, finding Jimmy, Frisky getting hurt. He sat up. The moon was shining into the room. What was that noise? Billy's heart gave a leap. It was Frisky lapping up milk from the dish. He was eating. He was better. Billy jumped up and knelt on the floor beside his pet. He stroked him gently. Frisky wagged his tail feebly and licked Billy's hand. A great happiness stole into Billy's heart. He knew Frisky was going to get well. Yay! Last chapter, chapter 19, The Big Secret. What was the secret Dad was talking about? Billy couldn't imagine. Must be something nice because both Dad and Aunt Kate seemed so excited about it. Tonight, they were all three going out to the steakhouse for dinner, and Dad promised to tell the secret then. When they got to the restaurant, Dad said Billy could order anything he wanted. So, Billy ordered a hamburger, french fries, and a chocolate milkshake. He hoped Aunt Kate wouldn't be able to finish her steak, so he could take what was left home to Frisky. Billy remembered how much Frisky had liked the piece of steak Mrs. Parker had brought him when he was well enough to eat it. Mrs. Parker liked Frisky now. She treated both Billy and Frisky like heroes since they had found Jimmy. But what could be Dad's secret? Dad waited until they were eating their dessert before he broke the news. For a few minutes, he simply twitched his nose, twirled the end of his mustache, and smiled. Then he put his big hand over Billy's hand and said, Billy, your Aunt Kate and I have decided to get married. Billy dropped his straw and stared at the couple across the table from him. Married? Then Aunt Kate would be his new mother. A slow grin spread over his face. Hey, neat, he said. As soon as they came back from the restaurant, Billy ran across the yard to tell Uncle John the wonderful news. And then they talked about a honeymoon, said Billy. What is a honeymoon like, Uncle John? The older man's eyes twinkled. I reckon a boy your age and a bachelor my age wouldn't understand much about honeymoons. He shrugged his shoulders. It's really just a trip, Billy, taken by a newly married couple. And us, put in Billy. Pete and you and me. They said we can come along and camp. Aunt Kate isn't used to tents, so they'll stay in hotel at nights, but they'll be with us sometimes during the day. Oh boy, will we have fun. I told you there was a camping trip in the offing, Uncle John reminded him with a chuckle. What about Frisky? I suppose the Parkers would be willing to keep him for you. I'll go ask Aunt Kate, answered Billy, turning to run across the yard to his own house. He was back in a moment with a big smile on his face. You'd never guess what Aunt Kate said, Uncle John. Then you better tell me. Aunt Kate said Frisky is going along, of course. We can't leave part of the family behind. Uncle John laughed. Now what do you know about that? He exclaimed. Uncle John kept on talking, but Billy didn't hear him. He was busy saying thank you to God for working everything out for good as he had promised. Yes, God was able to use all things in his plans, even Frisky. All things, even Frisky. Romans 8:28.